sorry, and thanks for admitting people, whoever does it currently. Classroom rules. Meeting will be recorded, so the people who can't make it tonight can watch it and listen to it later. Introduce yourself in the chat if you like. Also, the chat is there for questions. That first hour that we have with us, it's just going to be me, Anna, and Scott talking. But we'll love to pick questions from the chat if you have them. So go there. And Renee, your question, I'll get to that. Also about the art project, yes, I'll just say yes. We'll try to end around 8:30 officially, and then turn off the recording, hang out a little bit longer, kind of bonus material for those that are here, and we offer you to come off mute, offer your thoughts, what you thought was what really interested you, and any other questions that you have. If you have feedback on this series, on tonight's episodes, and past episodes, or have ideas for future episodes, let me know. By the way, I'm Robin Romer. I'm the VP for Legislation at Oregon PTA, and my email is legislation@Oregon PTA. And with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce our guests tonight, Anna Higgins and Scott Nye. Anna is the Director of Policy and Systems Strategy at Foundations for a Better Oregon. She came to FBO, which, as it is known, after 11 years at the High Desert Education Service District, where she served as Assistant Superintendent for the last 2 of those years. In that role, she had a first-hand view of the Student Success Act implementation, both from the regional perspective as well as the school district level. She brings with her a broad understanding of the education continuum, from all the way from early learning up to higher education, as she has worked both in college as a college instructor for pre-service teachers, which are teachers that aren't in the classroom yet, and as an interventionist for relief nurseries, which support and serve young children for families when they have the highest levels of stress, especially to prevent child abuse. Scott served as Assistant Superintendent of the Oregon Department of Education from 2019 till the end of last year. In those 4.5 years, he launched and led the Office of Education Innovation and Improvement at ODE. And that office was responsible and led the implementation of the Students Investment Account, the High School Success, and many other initiatives and investments. Before he was at ODE, Scott held positions as Executive Director for the Institute for Democratic Education in America, and as a Deputy Director for the National Public Education Support Fund. And as a consultant, he advised, among others, the Multnomah County Board of Commissioners, Chalkboard Project, and the Oregon Center for Education Equity. He's also a former middle school English teacher. Thank you so much, Anna, Scott, for being here and for joining us on a conversation about the Student Success Act. Can you tell us why you are the perfect guests to talk about the Student Success Act right now?
Wow, such a setup. Well, I'll start and then hand it over to the resident expert and Scott Nye. Thanks so much for having us and me. As you mentioned, from Foundations for a Better Oregon. I am coming up on my 90 days. I am very proud to be part of this team, and I'm still learning and growing into the role. Why are we positioned as FBO to be the first entity that's really taking this broad and in-depth look at the last 5 years and doing the work to illuminate both the implementation of the Student Success Act, or portions of it that we'll go into, and also the impact that has been made already in the first 5 years. I think what is true is FBO is a nonprofit, and it's also a project of Oregon philanthropy. And our work is focused in 4 buckets, and those 4 buckets can help to start to describe why us, why now. We focus our attention on policy and advocacy. We focus our attention on cultivating and pulling together, convening cross-sector collaboration in the spirit of partnership and problem solving. And this is where it really starts to illuminate the role that we're playing here, we spend a lot of time in the research, data, and storytelling space. And that's what this is. This project really matches our charge to demystify and make visible some parts of our very complex system so that folks like all of us in the room and legislators and directors and staff of community-based organizations and school districts can come to the table informed to make the system and the ecosystem better for kids and students. So we're here, we're so thrilled to be testing this out with you all. This is the first briefing we've done. We're about ready to launch a publication that is a series of 7 pieces that will be batched in 3 batches, the first coming out towards the end of this month. So we'll give you as much of a sneak preview as we can. Then I'll hand it over to Scott because he really knows his stuff in this area.
Thanks, Anna. It's really nice to be with everyone this evening. And I would just say, so Anna and FBO, key kind of philanthropic leaders connected to lots of education advocates. When I left the department, one of the conversations we had is essentially that there's a lot of confusion, whether it's with elected leaders or the general public, on what has happened with the Student Success Act. And of course, as you've all been traveling this series with Robin, you're having this conversation around what is overall happening with school funding and the state of schools. And you can't really understand school funding as a whole unless you include the Student Success Act. And of course, it is also only about 10% of the budget for most districts, the initiatives passed inside of it. So we'll spend a lot of time unpacking those things. FBO contracted me as a consultant to help in this development of this series. But I lived the 4.5 years of watching this law go from getting passed to the grindy implementation steps, partnering with lots of people, and trying to figure out how to give it a good launch, while also meeting headwinds like the pandemic and other kind of implementation challenges. So I'll dodge perfect, but I do think potentially helpful to get under the hood a little bit and into the details of what's actually happened. And my perspective is that there's a reason that a lot of people have confusion and concern, and often there are still some really important bright spots that have happened through the last 5 years that we don't pay as much attention to or don't know. And so I'll also hope to share some of those kinds of things.
Yeah, and to talk a little bit about the project that we haven't really spoken about. We have spoken about it offline, but just to make sure people know what's going on, FBO is doing a study on the Student Success Act. And those are the 7 pieces we're talking about. And you're going to launch it in a few weeks, so we get the pre-sneak. Do you want to talk a little bit about more the methodology that you used in when you studied the SSA, or maybe the 7 pieces, to delve a little bit into that?
Well, sure, absolutely. So we knew that we needed to look around. Again, our work is rooted in partnership and relationship. So we looked around and said, who can help us answer these questions of what has been true through the implementation phase, and what do we know about impact in the first 5 years? And so the methodology is a research project that has a series of, we partnered with OVBC, which is Oregon Values and Beliefs Center, to do some polling to understand, we'll talk more about that, to understand the values that underpin the SSA. That was a big part of our methodology. We worked with a firm who did case study work with different, there's 197 school districts, as you know, 19 ESDs, and the implementation of the portions of the SSA we're going to talk about live and breathe differently across the state. And so we did some case study work, we did some focus group work, we did some deep dive data analysis work with data that we could both to extract and then make sense of and analyze. And to be honest, we wrestled with the format because this is such a huge thing to try to unpack and understand in a way that's respectful of its implementation and impact. And so we wrestled with, should this come out as a large white paper? Should this come out in bite-sized chunks that are linked together? So in the end, we landed firmly in this 7-piece, 3-batch methodology, if you will. And we're hopeful that that is a way that each piece can stand alone, but can also weave together and reinforce each other. What else would you add, Scott, about methodology? You were in the weeds.
I think that's I just think trying to kind of hear from a few different perspectives, and it's not this is all essentially affects as a bit of a teaser trailer, but hopefully we'll get into the substance on this call some as well. I think it tries to not ignore where there are challenges or pretend like everything's rosy. It's not a commercial for it, but it does look at things that basically are often underpaid attention to. Something that's a big thing that happened in the department is the ways that families and communities, the expectation level for how districts engage them, the ways that longitudinal performance growth targets have been developed and shared with school boards. The general public isn't always aware of the kinds of things that the corporate activity tax is paid for, and the business community might be getting nervous about what those funds are doing. And part of the job of this was to basically say, let's make sure people have facts versus just like, shorthand perspective. So I think it will be valuable, and I hope you all will take a look once FBO releases it.
Thank you for that introduction. Tonight, we wanted to do 3 things. We want to talk about what were the goals of the SSA. As we evaluate the SSA, the Student Success Act, we need to figure out, what did we try to do? Then we'll talk about the implementation, which will probably the most part, as your study is focused on it, and then look forward on what's next. So the goals of the Student Success Act.
You froze for just a second for me, but I think I
Goals
got the
of the Student
question.
Success Act.
I think I know. Yeah, so a couple things to share. So first, just fun because we're here in live in the chat while I'm talking. I won't answer right away. How many programs and investments were included in the original passage of the Student Success Act? I'm not sure I have a prize, but if someone wants to toss a number out, let's see what happens. Obviously the fanfare was given to a historic new investment at the time. You've seen that from your prior series, right? So a little more than it's ended up being more than $1 billion a year, $2 billion a biennium. And the money and resources are split into 3 buckets. A bucket focused on early learning, a bucket focused on that student investment account, and a bucket focused on something called statewide education initiatives. Those are structures, but they're not goals. And because there were a lot of investments, I think there were a lot of things happening. In fact, if anyone wants to take the time to look back at the legislative report that led to the law, there was actually, I think Lori Wimmer covered this in the last call, there was $4 billion worth of ideas and like a litany of programs. I think the aim was a more whole system. There was certainly a lot of expectation from families that a more well-rounded education, a focus on student health and well-being, some attention to educator conditions. Teachers certainly had been demanding that their working conditions be improved, as well as questions and concerns about class size. And then there was a deep equity imperative for each focal student group population. So whether that be, students experiencing disability, students of color, students in poverty, there was a recognition that there are longstanding academic disparities. And even in Oregon, where we can't seem to agree on what should count as the academic standards, we understand that the disparities are real. And there was an effort to try to figure out a way to do that. That, again, you talked about in your last week, which was to give some level of local decision-making with some prescriptive deep set of ideas about plans. But there were investments in nutrition. There were investments in little small data systems that support 9th grade on track work. The committee really tried to fill in a lot of gaps that it would see different from the base school fund. And so I'd say you'd want to hold the big drivers being family, community engagement, focal students, disparity, and like student wellness. But you really got to get into the details. No one took my invitation to put an answer in the chat. We'll see how well. So you could tell that I was a middle school teacher. No one took it. 28 is the answer for the first round of the Student Success Act. And I'll, when I'm not talking, put a link into something that shows what they are now. But there's a lot of different investments that were made. And a lot of times when people talk about the Student Success Act, they're talking about some portion. Early learning folks are talking about early learning. Some folks are talking about the student investment account, which is 50% of the money and a big driver in terms of school improvement. It fully funds high school success, but other times people have like a little kind of tiny specific project they're talking about. And so it's always worth actually clarifying what people mean, because it gets confusing when we talk about it as a whole. So we'll do our best through this conversation to sort out what part of it we're talking about when we're talking about it, but we'll lay that out in terms of the bigger picture.
Do you think it was the way you describe it? It sounds a little bit, there was something in there for everybody. But would you say that there was some kind of overarching goal, or because you also mentioned that it's only 10% of the school budget, and kind of to use it as a lever to make changes? Does that?
I think that's a pretty fair description. I wasn't involved in the lawmaking. I was in Oregon and doing work nationally, but I came into the scene after it had been cooked into the implementation. So I learned about it all afterwards, like who was in what room, talking to whom about what to decide what. It's clear that, and again, Lori Wimmer touched on this in the last one, it's clear that there was discomfort with just adding more resource to the state school fund. There was a desire that districts provide increased focus. There were clear demands from teachers that they wanted to address class size. There were clear things from equity advocates about increasing culturally responsive teaching and learning. There's a longstanding understanding to increase instructional time in Oregon. There was the committee that traveled the state, all around the state, heard over and over and over again about student belonging and student mental health, and teachers shared concerns about student. We use the word behavioral health, which means substance abuse, not behavior in the classroom, although concerns were in both dimensions. And they certainly tried to create something that they thought would allow for some consistency of how districts might universally access these funds, but go through some rigorous planning processes, and then leave room for discretion so that Pendleton School District had already invested in class size so they could put their resources in mental health. Gladstone had already put resources in mental health so they could turn their attention. So it wasn't a one size fits all phenomenon. The basic structure is that, and then you have lots of smaller investments that are trying to figure out what are kind of targeted or evidence-based or community needed little entry points. And what I put in the chat is what it is in 23-25, just so you have your understanding of kind of the full scope of what is funded by the corporate activity tax.
What I'm hearing, and correct me if I'm misunderstanding, is there was both a desire to increase funding mostly for specific needs, but also find ways, a process to influence how school districts are making decisions.
And so again, here we're going to hone in just in K-12. You could have a whole separate conversation around early learning that would be important, and not an area that I have as much expertise in. There was absolutely a hope. In fact, it was both out loud on the record and in a budget footnote, which is legislative ease for when they pass the resources, the legislature marks something and says, please go do this. Districts already had to do a continuous improvement plan for state law, and they also had to do a continuous improvement plan for federal law. Prior to the SSA, they often did those things separately, and to be kind of unfair, many districts would do them as almost like separate from their real strategic process. They would just kind of do them as like check mark processes. And what they heard from leaders, which is still super true across the state, is school district leaders just feel overwhelmed. ODE administers more than 108 state and federal programs for districts. Most districts are responsive to about 70 of them, and they're just overwhelmed. They appreciate the help and the investment, but they feel overwhelmed by the sheer number of things they asked, and they wanted more alignment. So they charged the agency, and I took on this administrative charge to say, could you align federal school improvement to state school improvement to what is required for high school success submission with what is required for the new student investment account? But they very much wanted a routine ritual of community engagement, student engagement, focal student engagement, and staff engagement. Every single staff person, educators, classified staff, they wanted everyone to be engaged. They wanted the district to review data, disaggregated. They wanted the districts to review evidence-based practices. They wanted the district to attest that they had done all of those things in a deliberate process, along with a comprehensive needs assessment. And then they left, and they had to apply an equity lens to their choices and describe what they did with it. But then they left the actual resource choices of what they picked within a pretty broad set of allowable uses as it relates to the student investment account. But then because of that alignment, it ends up kind of growing in terms of its touch and reach as a kind of primary driver in terms of implementation and hope for the process.
So let's talk about implementation. What did you find? How is the Student Success Act implemented? What did you learn?
Yeah, great. So much.
Very easy question.
Very easy question. So, you know, and this is where I hope people will feel free as we go to chime in on the chat in terms of what you've seen and what's worked and what hasn't worked. And I think I'm relatively pragmatic about the fact that this has got bright spots and is uneven, but there are some really important things. So first, just I want to acknowledge with a little bit of pride in the team at ODE and the ESDs and the community-based organizations in the districts. Oregon's made a lot of big bets on a lot of big programs, and a lot of times they don't get off the ground. And you hear news stories about like failure to launch, and they never could get started, and the websites don't work. And this did not do that. We launched. We even launched and succeeded through a pandemic where the legislature cut the budget in the first year and froze some programs. So if anyone wants to question the education community as a whole about the effort and initiative to succeed when money was put on the table, we should all kind of enforce, go like, no, actually, everyone showed up and we figured out a way to get this to happen. Again, not perfectly, not pretending it's perfect, but I think that's an important thing that it did happen. One of the most important things is this routine ritual where at least every 2 years and the legal expectations on an ongoing basis to do meaningful family and community engagement. I'm clear on my departure from the agency. We're still a very long way from where I believe we should be as it relates to engaging focal students, families, communities, and staff. And we've radically changed how districts think about family and community engagement. Districts have very significant changes in terms of who they're asking, ways they're running focus groups, improved ways that they survey families, key teams and processes. Even little tiny school districts have changed the ways they give tickets at football games and sporting events to hear from families about what they want to have investments in. That's a pretty significant sea change, and the law requires that, and we should continue to hold the expectation for that. But that is a big change that's driven by this law, specifically with better tools from the agency to help districts do that. Every single district now does submit a plan 4 years at a time with 2 years of budget tied to outcomes. And they do that integrating their high school success plan with their CTE plan, with their school improvement plan, with their student investment account plan. They take that in front of their school board. The school board has to approve it in an open public meeting. That's an accountability that didn't exist prior. So the public has access to a moment to raise their hand and ask questions. It also requires that they report back every 4 years in a performance review in a public meeting. It also requires that they set these longitudinal performance growth targets. And for the first time in Oregon, period, like all of this time, there are co-developed longitudinal growth targets set for absenteeism, third grade reading, ninth grade on track, and graduation rates for all but the very smallest schools, where if you have less than 80 kids, that the school board has agreed to, the ODE has agreed to, and the administration has agreed to, that sets baseline and stretch targets for the entire state for the next 5 years. We don't like where our numbers are at in Oregon in many ways. Maybe you could argue about ninth grade on track. But we actually have set real, not politically artificial targets rooted in real math tied to differential indicators. And even if they're not the perfect indicators, it's a way to actually hold ourselves to some serious business on behalf of kids. And that infrastructure was paid for by the CAT tax and implemented by districts and ESDs and ODE, and all that exists now that didn't exist before. There are many other things, including what they actually paid for. So, we have some slides we can put in the chat or flash up, but we had a huge expenditure in health and safety workforce. It makes sense because it launched amidst the pandemic, but we've increased social workers, school psychologists, nurses statewide. In fact, what will kind of in this Fuller report here, you can see a couple of these. We've basically hit a problem, which was predictable and still a big challenge, which is we've probably hired most of the available competitive workforce in Oregon in these areas. And so there's
real quick on that chart.
Yeah.
We have, if I remember correctly, about 2,000 schools in Oregon. Is that
100 schools? That's a good question. I think it's higher than that. Let me look and I'll tell you for sure.
Yeah, but I'm seeing 300 nurses, and I've seen these slides. If you want to go forward, I want to really point this out. On school psychologists, like it's a little bit tough to read. 89 school psychologists in the state of Oregon. When I saw that, I was a little bit shocked. I'm really happy about the growth, but I just wanted to point that out for the audience because it's thanks God. It's really valuable to understand where we're coming from. But yeah, sorry, you talk about the workforce and the changes that people see in schools.
Yeah, and we're seeing similar. There's positive changes in class size in terms of reduction. The law requires evidence-based class size reduction. You can't just uniformly reduce class size, but you see changes in class size. But these, I agree with you, these are actually pretty far away from where we should want to be. But it is a clear marker of the law passing and an increase in those numbers. And then the challenge is that where we might want those numbers to go higher, if there are resources to go higher, we actually now are at an edge where most districts are reporting they cannot find quality workforce in these areas. So that's a different problem to solve, right? Which is like we have one way to think about that. We have to sometimes be creative then to think about ways to help address student mental health, or you have to have like a nurse for the district and then, find creative ways to do that. So folks are coming up with those ideas, and that way we have to be very Oregon about it and kind of DIY our way into some solutions. But that gives you some sense of where implementation is at. Anna was a big part of implementing this law in the region she worked in High Desert. And Anna, I don't know if there's anything you'd want to add just in terms of like big implementation elements that people would want to hear about.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I would add is that I was in an education service district. So there are 19 of those, 197 school districts, and the role of ESDs was unique during this rollout over the last 5 years. And so I guess I'll speak to that. These 19 ESDs serve the school districts that are in their geographic region. And so, that can be over 20 school districts, that can be 5 school districts, depending on the region that you're in and the geography of that area. The tricky thing is that I'm sure you've talked about technical assistance on this in these conversations before, but most people don't understand what that even means when we say that the education service districts provided technical assistance to their regional school districts. So a more layperson way to understand that from my perspective is to use language like connective tissue, linking, building bridges between, building capacity that you can be more efficient on economy of scale with a region versus district by district by district. But it's really, I think, important from an ESD lens and also from a district lens that the implementation was happening within the districts. And the 19 ESDs played a quiet but critical role in bridging communication and implementation possibility from the department through with Scott's team through to districts. And then something we haven't talked about, Scott, is, right as we were getting catching the momentum and the wind of it, the pandemic hit. And this isn't to do the thing that we're all sort of tired with at this point, which is like blaming things on the pandemic. But what I would highlight is that what I experienced on the ground is that the SSA and the portions of that we've been talking about tonight were very protective. The systems and the infrastructure that was built and had buy-in across the state of Oregon served as a protective infrastructure to keep Oregon schools functioning during a global pandemic. And Scott can really speak well to that, but it's something that we can't just talk about the last 5 years without talking about specifically. And I think there's a lot of wins that happened there. We weren't anticipating those because we weren't anticipating the pandemic, but through Scott's leadership, we're able to very quickly pivot that infrastructure to support schools and students in the way that they needed to be during the pandemic.
Yeah, thanks. And I will say a little bit about it, and then I want to also come back to put all this in perspective for this series in terms of like, so how does this all fit in terms of making sense of school funding? Anna's right, and one of the biggest impacts is we got a lot of interest, not just from districts, but many community-based partners, organizations, ESDs were working very hard on that first wave of engagement in the fall of 2019. And again, far from perfect, lots of room for improvement, particularly in the type of meaningful engagement. We still have a little bit of an addiction using pretty simplistic surveys with parents as opposed to deeper inquiry and engagement and holding different perspectives. But there was a lot of energy and a lot of effort expended. And then as the pandemic arrived, the legislature called an emergency session. And of all the hard choices they made, and I respect their hard choices, but they were quite difficult. The biggest funding move they made was to cut the student investment account from $500 million to $150 million in that very first year, to suspend the hiring of staff to support implementation, and perhaps extra challenging, they froze all the longitudinal performance growth target infrastructure in terms of setting goals. And the biggest impact from my perspective in that is as it relates to family and community engagement, because families and communities had bought in and engaged, I believe, in many ways. And then suddenly districts didn't have the money they thought they were going to have, and were juggling with a pandemic. And I think it left people feeling a little out in the cold and often disengaged. And there were a few districts that I think did a very good job talking their families and communities through these phenomenons. But in many places, I think folks felt like, I went to this big dreaming session. I was excited by the SSA. We laid down all these great things, and then none of it happened. And we went into this tunnel called COVID. And then I think from there forward, we hear all about federal ESSER dollars, and we hear about the state school fund, and we're in our kind of current climate. And I think people are like, whatever happened with that Student Success Act thing? And when did those resources come back? And what did they do? And I think that's a lot of people's general understanding. And from my perspective, actually, a lot of good did come from them. One part is, to Anna's point, we used that infrastructure in that painful cut moment, and we pivoted it to do pandemic response. And ESDs didn't wait for the legal government contracts to step in and help. And we were meeting with local public health, and we were meeting with teachers, and we just mobilized a lot of energy to try to do right by folks. And you can like or hate whatever choices got made for the pandemic, but in those first few months when it was really chaotic and knowing what to do, we just tried to do the right thing by lots of people. And these resources helped do that. And it did build buy-in and understanding of these more complicated health systems, that when the money got turned back on in the next year, districts had better choices to make about where to put money as it relates to health and safety. And they had more options to figure out what would they use the state cat tax SSA money for, and what would they use federal money for? Some districts have succeeded with that better than others. But that kind of overall things played out. What I think has been lost is the general public's imagination of the SSA is kind of lost. And because you have the funding cliff of ESSER and inflation, you suddenly have districts looking for resources, and people who fought and advocated for the SSA are kind of like, what do we do? Kind of like your last presentation with Lori, going like, we thought we solved these problems and they're still here. What I would argue is that a lot of good work has been done in the meantime that we shouldn't lose focus of, even as we face the challenge of the present moment. And what I do hope is that folks will kind of take the time to make sure they know what's unfolded in the given, particularly if you're doing statewide advocacy, that you pay attention in each district what's happened. And also hold your districts accountable. They still have the expectation to engage students and families. They still have the expectation to put forward clear plans and budgets tied to outcomes. And if you're not seeing those things get talked about in your community and in your school board, you should be advocating to do them, because it is the expectation that should be happening. And we're entering that cycle this fall of like another wave of big community engagement to inform plans that get submitted to ODE in the spring.
I have two more smaller questions about the implementation before we're moving on to what's next. One is, I was wondering if either through study or for your own personal experience, you have some very specific examples of how school districts use the money for, that directly affected the kids that you want to highlight. Maybe one or two. And then I have one more question.
There's a ton, and I'll find after I'm done talking, because I can't multitask, a link that actually gives you access to most of the district's plans, and you can see with really close detail, because it's useful to look with close detail. It's never like one thing, so but we're one of the ones we've profiled with a case study in the documents, the Phoenix Talent School District, which did a deep partnership around student mental health with a community partner called La Clinica. And they used and leveraged the family community engagement from the first wave of implementation of the SIA to the response to the pandemic, to their after investments in terms of how they've maintained supports. And they've brought kind of both the community mental health and offsite and onsite resources to each of the schools in their school district in really skillful ways, as an example. There are, literally 30 districts that all the electives people wanted in terms of more well-rounded kinds of things, increased music, increased electives, tons of hands-on learning opportunities, all purchased there. There's a big investment in K-3 learning pre the governor's literacy initiative to increase the number of teachers, decrease class sizes. Most of the educational leadership in the state already knew that that's where evidence-based lied, and the governor's investment reinforced that with tighter expectations in terms of literacy. But these are all the kinds of things being spent. The last one I'll talk about is in Eastern Oregon. There's trying to remember the name of the school district, but they put a lot of resources in. They blended their CTE resources, their high school success resources, and their SI resources to improve their hands-on learning. And in particular, I got to visit this CTE shop that is a full mechanic auto shop, training all students of many different genders to all basically gain their mechanic credentials. And they were really, really skillful in how they leverage putting more than one resource together. So there really is just a litany of things that people have done to improve the offerings to students.
Anna, do you want to add something from your?
Yeah, we touched on it, but I think it's important to note that that the focus on health and safety, and Scott's going to put this link in the chat, which you'll be able to see the specifics, but specific staffing. And we gave you a quick glimpse at nursing and counselor ratios and school psychologists, but people, we're in education, we are in the business of people. 90% of our budgets go towards people. And so you will see in there that was across the state in different ways for different purposes, like Scott said, whether it was reducing class size or specific targeted supports for safety and mental health.
Thank you. The last question on implementation that I wanted to ask was about the relationship between districts and the state. And would you say that the Student Success Act, we talked a lot about accountability and local accountability to your community. Do you feel that the SSA shifted something in the relationship between states and the state and the district? Or how would you describe that?
I'll go first, but Anna, I really want to hear your answer. I would say we aspired to do that from my perspective. And I have big belief and confidence in the staff at ODE and their effort level. They don't get a lot of attention. They have very hard jobs. They work very hard to serve the public well. We aspired to change it to much more of a let's get shoulder to shoulder, and we tried to get rid of the kind of let's manage by shame and compliance, but instead work from a place of integrity. And if we fall short of a standard, we treat it like we treat good teachers treat student work. So if a district fell short, we didn't shame them, we didn't put them in the newspaper, but we did name that they fell short and then provide resources or help or get alongside them to help try to get them up to the level without changing the standard. So, not with a lot of fanfare. When we did our first few rounds of review for these plans, not all the districts met all the requirements. They often fell short, and we held all of those lines, and we provided lots of feedback and expectation. Districts didn't always love that extra workout level, but they understood that there was real integrity to the process. I do think that's still unfolding, right? One of the big challenges and questions is how to have that happen as there's multiple changes of leadership. We have huge turnover of school superintendents across the state, changes in ESD leadership, changes in state leadership, changes in governor, and we need to be able to see these things stay the course across people. But I do think that there's at least a moment where we have gotten people to believe that something more significant can change, that the system can get made more coherent, that there can be real partnership between districts and communities and ESDs and tribal nations and OD, and that we could get headed in the same direction. We're still not there, but I think there is a little, some inklings of possibility that have happened through the last 5 years. Anna, what would you lived this?
Yeah, I did, and I won't speak for the full state, but I will speak for the Central Oregon region. And just anecdotally, this was a significant and palpable shift in the relationship between districts, ESDs, and the Department of Education. There is a natural tension because there is just the history of both holding the resource and the compliance role, which is a tricky place for a department to be. And that tension leaned before these 5 years, and really before probably the last 4 years, towards us versus them. And maybe it was also partially because of the pandemic. There was some trauma bonding, and I don't say that lightly, but that we were in it together. And so there was trust like we had never seen before. And maybe because it was necessary for survival, but it did post-pandemic, when kids were back in schools, it did sustain. And I am hopeful. I'm no longer with the ESD, and Scott's no longer with the department, but we are both hopeful that of the sustaining kind of muscle memory around this is the way we do things around here. We work together on behalf of kids. And I believe I'm seeing evidence of that on the ground still. We're hearing from superintendents, both at the ESD level and the district level, stay the course. Like, we have a rhythm. We get this now. We're not perfect, but we're getting better. Let us keep doing this together. So I think the answer is yes, Robin.
And in a very positive direction, which is awesome to hear. And maybe not what I have to say for myself would have expected from something that has more administrative burden, that seems like more specific targets, that does not necessarily sound at first like this is going to be more cooperation. But I'm glad to hear that it turned out that way, and that brings us forward. So what's next for the student success? Where do you see it going? Where do you want to see it going?
Yeah, I love the way you put that synopsis together. And I think what's next is that this is actually every day, every year work, and it's precarious. These partnerships, these rhythms of progress and accountability, they bump up against our history in Oregon, which is it's really hard to stay the course on things that involve long-term systems change. And so what's next is we're heading into the 25-27 legislative session, and we at FBO want Oregon to be to go into that aware and educated about what's happened, but what still needs to be built forward. And to resist that urge, and Barbara Smith-Warner will say this again and again, resist that urge to put things down too soon. And the SSA is an example of that. So that, and this Scott can say this better, I think this is even a quote from Scott, but we feel it so deeply in Oregon and FBO. To resist that urge is to resist being in a perpetual state of early launch implementation, which is the hardest place to get through. And if we see ourselves as just over that tipping point, let's do that together. Let's resist that urge. Scott, what do you have to say? What's next?
You said it so well. Go ahead, Ron.
Yeah, I also want to hear maybe where do you see things need some adjustments?
Yeah, I'll do some of that, and Anna can close it back up. Everything Anna said is true. Oregon is not alone. I got a chance to work nationally and have been to all but 2 US states and spent lots of time on lots of different education systems. There's a deep, almost addiction to, we have a problem, we come up with a solution, we begin to get ourselves into the solution, and then we hit the difficulty. This makes sense if any one of you have tried to change your own habits, or you tried to work with anybody, you get into doing the actual thing, and it's always harder than the idea of what it would be to do. And in a place where we have naturally a lot of pain points, people rightly get itchy and have hard questions, and it can sound like you're enabling mediocrity when you're saying give it more time. But in Oregon, we have consistently given something 4 or 5 years, and right when it begins to bear fruit, it's in a messy state of implementation, and we just reshuffle the deck and then wonder why we don't make progress. And if you study, I'm a big fan of the work of Michael Fullen, and he addressed the student success committee that brought this legislation forward. He said, you need at least 10 years to see implementation through. The highest performing educational systems in the world stay the course for 10 years. So I really believe in that. And I'm really clear that we still have a lot more to do to get to have a coherent system. So what we've done with the SSA is important. But as I said, it's about 10% of most districts' budgets. And if you talk to any administrator, they will have different opinions about how all this went down. Some will say it's great and they fully aligned their systems, and others will say it's got some benefits and they're frustrated by the amount of planning they have to do. And others of them will balk at it because what we have done requires more of teams and staff in a region talking to each other and getting aligned and having to know what each other's doing, and less just like check mark, shuffle the boxes. But they still have the whole rest of the other 70, 80 programs that they have to initiate in district that don't all map up together. And we use different maps for different implementation programs in the state. For that matter, we're all focused on 3rd grade reading, and then we turn around and tell families to opt out of tests. I'm not a big standardized test person, but you can't have it all the same ways. Tell everybody to opt out and then use the test score to tell everybody that they're not meeting an expectation. That just it doesn't make any sense. So we still got to work out some kinks in Oregon. My hope is that we'll learn from the last 5 years and keep making the system simpler and stronger and make more sense. and we'll make some hard choices. What is it that we actually think is meaningful learning in the world now for these kids in the next 20 years? And it's probably not what it was 30 years ago. So there's still a lot of room to innovate, but some of the bones of what we've done, rituals of engagement, applying an equity lens to investments, outcome-based budgeting, one strategic planning process that everyone gets eyes on. Those are good things. We shouldn't get rid of them, right? And expectation that there should be intervention when districts are struggling, but done skillfully. These are all really good things. I'm not retired, but I'm not focused on I don't have a role in the 25 legislative session, nor am I looking for one. I cheer us on down these roads. I think what we need to solve for in the relationship is we need to make sure the business community hears a thank you from educators, because I think we are seeing the cat tax work, but we've kind of almost like stopped talking about it as if we're embarrassed, and we ought to just be like, yeah, actually we support kids in Oregon. Let's keep that corporate activity tax cooking. Thank you, businesses. Thank you, consumers who are paying it when they pay for businesses' goods. So I think that should happen. I think we have to sort out accountability mechanisms so they make sense with what the laws are that are already passed, or simplify them. I don't think we should create like a whole nother theory of accountability different from what's been tried out here. And I think we have to stay the course with engaging every student, every focal student, their families, staff, and educators as part of the story. I don't think schools can belong just to the administrative faculty. They have to belong to the whole community, to their tribes, to every kid. So I hope those things will stick around, and we'll see what the future holds. Anna, what would you add for?
Yeah, I would add, with the infrastructure in place around watching our progress, we're not where we want to be. When we look at the numbers that the SSA has built systems for accountability to watch and measure over time. So staying focused and accelerating our ambition, and I don't mean that we're not working hard, but looking at our targets, not to be politically motivated, but to say kids deserve better, and to keep the systems in place that help us to see and support districts that and schools and teachers to get to that place for kids.
Thank you so much, both of you, for that discussion on the Student Success Act. I have two more questions that are not related to the Student Success Act, but in particular, but just generally and personally. And the first question is, what is something that you like about Oregon schools? And the second is, and I've been asking all our guests these questions, what is something you know about that you would like to see in more schools?
I'll go and then let Scott finish up. I'm a mother of 3 children. I have a child in elementary, middle, and high school in the Ben Lapine district. So I am seeing it all right now. I'm also have been in Oregon my entire life. So I was raised by a single mom who is a retired educator now, and went to the Corvallis Public Schools from the time I was 1st grade through 12th grade. I'm a big education, public education specifically runs really deep in me. So what do I love? I love, in the roles that I've been in, the seats that I've sat in, seeing how the spirit of collaboration from the teacher level to the school leader to the systems leader across Oregon, there is a spirit of working together and learning from each other. And what I do know is that when adults have that spirit and learn together and grow together with other adults across the system, that kids benefit. I spent a lot of time and deep learning and work around family and community engagement. And I think that we've spent a lot of time talking about that tonight, and I'm thrilled that the SSA has built infrastructure there. We've got a long way to go, and I hope to see more kind of skill and will of school districts actively engaging with families, parents, their community-based organizations, and community leaders, because these aren't just K-12's kids and students, these are our children. And there's very strong research, Karen Mapp from Harvard and many others, that that point towards the benefit of kids when communities and families and schools work together. So I want to see more of that.
Thank you, Anna.
So one of the reasons long ago I decided to work in schools, other than the fact that I was raised by 2 educators and I trauma bonded with them, no, that's a joke, is the world, the world shows up in a classroom, and we have so few places where people who have different viewpoints still can show up together and learn how to be alongside each other and learn. And schools are really, I think, the last public space. And I believe it's just like a really sacred profession. And so I had the chance to visit Jordan Valley, a school in Eastern Oregon, and I was delighted to see the level of care and belonging for this middle and high school space, and is very rooted to place, lots of applied learning, but the quality of the teaching was really high, and that's actually the thing. I can pick specific things. I like community schools, I like middle school crew advisories, but we high performing educational systems treat teaching like a sacred profession. They understand that the future of a state, a country, a city, a community is about people who teach. The teacher can be the bus driver, the teacher can be the person who's serving lunch, the teacher doesn't have to be the classroom credentialed teacher. But there is something about healthy adults responding to kids, and adults who are not overly permissive and like let the kids do whatever they want and are not authoritarian and shut down kids' spirits. And when you see a really good teacher hit the right notes and the kid light up, there's nothing better than that. And every kid deserves that in every school in Oregon. And that's the thing that I want to see more of.
Thank you both. Thank you both so much for your time tonight and for the work you've done and you're continuing to do. And I'm looking forward to the 7 parts and pieces that you're going to publish in 3 batches. I've learned as well by now, and looking forward to continuing this conversation. And I have now some announcement as I go back to my little slideshow. Those were our rules. Not multitasking, obviously, here very well. So we have, if you follow this the series, we have put together documents on school funding, how it works, and background material. And let me finally share here. You can find that at this link, bit.ly/edfundingoregon. And I always love to hear from people, or there may be resources that we should be adding and so forth. We've also updated our website, OregonPTA.org, our advocacy website, and put more information about both the series, about school funding in general, and everything else Oregon PTA is doing on there. And we obviously, this is not the last episode, but one of many to come. We're currently in conversations with OCA, or classified staffs union, and OEA, or teachers union. We don't have dates like tied down yet, unfortunately. But look out for that. I'll communicate that as soon as possible. And I'm planning to do an open mic night on November 13th to hear from all of you and give you an opportunity to kind of share where you see school funding, what are things that you've learned, and maybe things you want to go into more. And yeah, I've not forwarded my presentation. Thank you so much. And with that, I'll stop not only sharing, but also recording.